Michael Learned spent years pretending she wasn't in love with Ralph Waite. On screen, they were husband and wife, soulmates in every sense. But off-screen, the truth was far more complicated and far more painful. For nearly a decade, they shared quiet glances, deep respect, and something that neither of them dared to name. Not while the cameras were rolling, not while the world was watching, and not while life kept pulling them in different directions. They kept their secret for over 40 years. But now, Michael has finally broken her silence. And what she's admitted about Ralph Waite has left fans in tears. When the Waltons premiered in 1972, no one, not the network, not the cast, not even the audience, could have predicted what it would become. A quiet drama about a rural family surviving the Great Depression wasn't exactly flashy television. But almost instantly, it struck a chord. Viewers didn't just watch the show, they felt it. And at the heart of that emotional pull were two people, Michael Learned and Ralph Waite. She played Olivia Walton, the strong yet gentle matriarch. He played John Walton Sr., the solid, kind-hearted father. Together, they built a home that millions of Americans wished they could step into. The chemistry was immediate, the connection undeniable. But what viewers didn't know was that something else was happening behind the scenes. Something much deeper than scripted lines or shared scenes. Michael was new to television. A theater-trained actress, she had never acted for the screen before the Waltons. Ralph, too, came from the stage. They were both serious about their craft. Intense, committed, passionate performers. But from the beginning, there was something more. They understood each other instinctively. Their rhythm, their timing, their emotional beats. They all fell into place effortlessly. And that wasn't acting. According to Michael, there was a magnetic pull between them from the very beginning. They clicked in a way that felt bigger than work. And yet, even as that quiet bond began to grow, they made an unspoken decision. They would never cross the line. Michael was married. Ralph was recently divorced. And neither of them wanted to damage what they were building on screen. So they tucked it away. They smiled for the cameras. They stood shoulder to shoulder through scene after scene. And they never said a word. Michael later admitted that she fell in love with Ralph very early on, but never pursued anything romantic. She said they were in love, but not lovers. It's a distinction that feels simple on the surface, but for anyone who's ever loved someone from a distance, it carries enormous weight. What makes their story so unique isn't just the affection they shared. It's the restraint. The decision to not act on something so powerful, even while working side by side for years. Day in, day out, through long shoots and emotional scenes, they kept that truth buried. And no one on set ever suspected a thing. But there were moments, small, quiet moments, when the depth of their bond would rise to the surface. A glance that lingered, a hand held just a moment too long, a scene that felt just a bit too real. Those who watched closely might have sensed something. But to most, it was just good acting. That's what made it work. That's what made the Waltons feel so honest. Because, in some ways, it was. As the show gained momentum, Michael and Ralph became the emotional compass of the series. They weren't just acting out family values, they were living them, supporting each other through personal struggles, covering for each other on hard days, lifting each other in moments of doubt, and all the while keeping that quiet truth between them. What began as a working relationship became something much more, an unspoken love story. But for now, it would remain just that, unspoken. As the Waltons continued to thrive through the 1970s, Michael Learned and Ralph Waite became household names. But what no one saw was the emotional thread quietly tying them together behind the camera. While America tuned in to watch Olivia and John navigate the struggles of raising 7 children through the Great Depression, the two actors were navigating something much more personal, something real, something tender. Their bond wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the stuff of scandal. It was subtle and sacred. It showed up in the smallest gestures. A knowing smile, a steadying touch on set, a wordless look when emotions ran high in a scene. Those who worked closely with them often commented on their incredible chemistry, but they assumed it was just good casting. In reality, it was something far deeper and far more complicated. Michael and Ralph were both strong-willed, deeply passionate people. They could challenge each other, push each other, and, perhaps most importantly, see through each other. If Ralph was having a bad day, Michael would sense it before he said a word. If Michael was struggling with a difficult scene or personal turmoil, Ralph was the first to quietly offer support. There was a deep, intuitive understanding between them. The kind of connection that doesn't happen often, even in lifelong friendships. And yet, they remained firmly in the boundaries of professionalism. Michael was married at the beginning of the show's run, and though her marriage ended during the series, she still carried a sense of caution and emotional responsibility. Ralph, too, had his own struggles, battling alcoholism and trying to rebuild his life after personal loss. Timing was never on their side, and perhaps, deep down, they both knew that crossing the line could risk everything. The show, their reputations, and the trust they'd built with each other. Still, there were moments, not dramatic ones, just small, human ones. Michael has recalled how Ralph would sometimes take her hand during breaks in filming, gently, protectively. How he would encourage her when she doubted herself. How he never once made her feel unsafe or judged or alone. There was a warmth between them that didn't need words. It simply existed. And over time, that warmth grew into something more. Love, not the kind that burns hot and fast, but the kind that stays quietly in the background. Present, patient, and profoundly painful in its silence. Michael once said that what they shared was a deep, spiritual connection. Something beyond physical attraction or romantic tension. They were, in many ways, kindred spirits. Two people who had weathered storms, who understood grief and healing, who found solace in each other's presence. But even as they drew closer emotionally, they stayed apart in every other way. For nearly a decade, they filmed together almost daily, always just within reach, and always just out of bounds. It's easy to romanticize stories like this, to imagine stolen moments and secret declarations. But theirs wasn't that kind of story. It was quieter, sadder, and in some ways far more powerful. Because what they chose to do, not act on their love, wasn't out of fear. It was out of respect. Respect for each other. Respect for their work. And perhaps respect for the possibility that some things are too sacred to risk. Even decades later, when Michael finally opened up about what they shared, there was no bitterness in her voice. Only tenderness. Only memory. Only a kind of aching gratitude for a love that was never quite spoken but always understood. When the Waltons ended in 1981, it didn't feel like a typical goodbye. The show had become more than just a television series. It was a part of America's heart. And for Michael Learned and Ralph Waite, walking away from it wasn't just leaving a job. It was stepping out of a world they had built together, brick by emotional brick. In the years that followed, both actors pursued other work. Michael went on to star in other series and stage productions. Ralph returned to theater and took on a number of television roles, eventually gaining a new generation of fans through his appearances on shows like NCIS and Bones. They both had success. They both kept busy. But for each of them, the Waltons was something irreplaceable, and so was the connection they had shared while making it. Off-screen, they remained close, friends, companions, supporters of one another's careers. But the deeper truth, the emotional bond they never acted on, remained buried. For decades, Michael said nothing publicly. She kept it to herself. She carried it quietly. It wasn't until years later, long after the spotlight had shifted and time had softened the sharp edges of memory, that she began to open up. Not in tabloids or television interviews, but in brief, honest reflections, moments where the past felt safe enough to revisit. She revealed that she had been in love with Ralph Waite. Not in the way fans might imagine. Not a whirlwind affair or a dramatic romance, but a real, lasting, complicated love. One rooted in deep understanding, mutual respect, and shared life experience. A love that lasted silently for decades. And for all those years, she never said a word. Why didn't she speak up sooner? That's the question so many fans ask. But for Michael, the silence wasn't about shame or fear. It was about protection. She didn't want to distort the memory. She didn't want to turn something sacred into something sensational. And maybe She didn't want to admit to herself how much it had meant, because admitting it meant facing it. And facing it meant confronting the pain of what never was. When she finally did speak about it, her words were gentle, not dramatic. She said, "We were in love, but we never crossed the line." That sentence carries decades of emotion. Longing, restraint, admiration, and the kind of heartbreak that never really leaves you. There's a particular kind of sorrow in loving someone you can't have. Not because they don't love you back, but because the timing never aligned. Because the world said no. Because real life got in the way. And that's exactly what happened with Michael and Ralph. Even after the show ended, even after their lives went in different directions, Michael carried that love. Quietly, respectfully, and for a long time alone. But there's something powerful in that kind of silence. Something noble. Something that speaks to a generation who understands that not all love stories end with a kiss. Some end with a goodbye. Or worse, with nothing said at all. Fans who loved the Waltons always sensed there was something real between Olivia and John Walton. Now they know they were right. But even knowing the truth, it still feels bittersweet. Because the love was real. And so was the choice to keep it unspoken. Michael didn't share her story for attention. She shared it because it was time. Because Ralph was gone. Because grief often opens doors that time keeps closed. And because, after 40 years of silence, the heart sometimes needs to speak. When Ralph Waite passed away in 2014 at the age of 85, tributes poured in from fans, former co-stars, and colleagues across the industry. He was remembered not just as the steady, fatherly presence of the Waltons, but as a man of deep conviction, quiet humility, and undeniable warmth. But for Michael Learned, the loss wasn't just public. It was personal. It was the closing of a chapter that had never been fully written. In interviews around that time, Michael struggled to speak about Ralph without her voice cracking. Even decades after the Waltons had ended, the bond between them hadn't faded. It had simply gone underground, quiet, enduring, and unresolved. And now, with his passing, any lingering hope that they might one day have that conversation was gone. She admitted it then, finally. She had loved him. She always had. And she never told him. That confession, simple, devastating, struck a deep chord with fans. Because who hasn't held back words they later wish they'd said? Who hasn't kept silent out of fear, or duty, or timing? Only to find that life doesn't always give second chances. Michael said she believed Ralph loved her, too. But they never spoke about it. Not directly, not openly. There was a mutual understanding, an unspoken agreement to keep that part of their connection sacred and untouched. And so they carried it quietly for all those years. But his death changed everything. In the stillness that follows grief, Michael finally began to reflect aloud on what they'd shared. Not in dramatic terms. There were no declarations of missed soulmates or could-have-beens. Just the quiet heartbreak of someone who had loved deeply and waited too long to say it. She said, "We never crossed the line. We respected each other too much." And then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "But we were in love." That final phrase broke something open in the hearts of longtime fans. It gave a new context to every scene they had ever shared. Suddenly, those warm glances and tender touches felt different, more personal, more true. It wasn't just acting. It was love wrapped in restraint. And yet, there was no scandal here, no betrayal, just two people who met at the wrong time, who loved each other in silence, who did the right thing for everyone but themselves. After Ralph's passing, Michael carried that grief with the same quiet dignity she had always shown. She didn't exploit it. She didn't dramatize it. She simply honored the truth, a truth that had lived inside her for over 40 years. The regret wasn't loud, it was soft. It lived in the way her voice trailed off when she spoke about him, in the long pauses between words, in the memories that surfaced not as sharp pangs, but as gentle aches. There's something profoundly human about her story. It's not just about love, it's about timing, about boundaries, about the choices we make to protect what matters most, even if it costs us something of ourselves. For Michael Learned, that cost was never telling the man she loved how she truly felt. Not until it was too late. But in finally speaking the truth, she gave herself and her audience a kind of closure. The love may have gone unspoken while he was alive, but it was never forgotten. And now, years later, fans see the Waltons differently. They understand what was happening behind those soft scenes and heartfelt moments. They see not just two actors, but two hearts navigating a love they could never fully claim. For over 4 decades, Michael Learned kept her love for Ralph Waite tucked away, like a letter never mailed. Not because it wasn't real, not because she doubted it, but because she felt it didn't belong to anyone else. It was private, personal, sacred. She never sought to rewrite their story. She never hinted at regret in public. She let the Waltons stand as it was. A show about family, about resilience, about love that wasn't always loud. And in that quiet dignity, she mirrored her own real-life heartbreak. But grief has a way of unearthing truths we thought we could carry forever. And after Ralph passed, Michael found herself no longer willing, or perhaps no longer able, to keep it all inside. That's when she finally said it. In her own voice, with no embellishment, just the truth. We were in love. So why now? Why not all those years ago? Because sometimes the silence is the love. The act of keeping something sacred, of protecting someone else's peace, is its own kind of devotion. Michael stayed silent not because she was afraid, but because she respected Ralph too much to turn their bond into something public. She knew what they had, and that was enough. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Ralph's absence made room for words, and Michael, now older, softer, and perhaps a bit more willing to let the past breathe, allowed herself to speak what had gone unspoken for most of her life. Not for drama, not for validation, but for release. She wasn't trying to change how people viewed the Waltons. In fact, she was confirming what many long suspected, that the love audiences felt from John and Olivia wasn't just performance. It came from a real place, a place of deep care, understanding, and quiet heartbreak. A place she hadn't been able to name while he was still here. And perhaps that's what makes her story resonate so deeply with fans. Because it's not about missed chances in the Hollywood sense. It's about restraint, about grace, about the complicated, often invisible sacrifices that so many make in the name of timing, loyalty, or moral clarity. By finally telling the truth, Michael wasn't reopening wounds. She was closing a chapter. She was honoring Ralph and the bond they shared. And in doing so, she offered something rare to her fans. Not a scandal or a headline, but a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity. There is no revenge, no affair, no betrayal, just two people who loved each other in a world that didn't make space for that love. And instead of forcing it, they carried it. Silently, respectfully, with eyes that said more than words ever could. Now, decades later, fans are seeing their scenes in a new light. That quiet hug in the kitchen, that tearful goodbye at the door, the softness in Ralph's voice when he said, "Live." These were not just performances. They were fragments of a deeper truth, one that Michael held in her heart for over 40 years. And in speaking it aloud, she gave permission to everyone watching to grieve the things they never said, to mourn the might-have-beens, and to believe that even the quietest love stories are still love stories. Because sometimes, love doesn't look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a secret carried for a lifetime and finally let go. In the world of television, most love stories are written in scripts, acted out, edited, and packaged for an audience. But the story between Michael Learned and Ralph Waite, that was something else entirely. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. And for years, it wasn't even spoken. It lived in the spaces between lines. In the way he looked at her across the dinner table. In the quiet strength of her voice when she called him John. In the long days on set when neither of them said a word about what they were feeling, but both knew. For over 40 years, Michael kept that love to herself. She didn't use it to sell books. She didn't build a brand around it. She simply carried it. Because that's what people of her generation did. They loved with grace. They mourned in silence. And they held on to the things that mattered most without needing the world's approval. But when Ralph was gone, something shifted. Michael finally spoke the words she had never dared to say. They were in love. And in doing so, she gave millions of people permission to remember their own buried feelings, their own long-kept secrets, their own silent goodbyes. For fans of the Waltons, it changes everything, and nothing, because deep down we always knew. We saw it in their eyes. We felt it in every episode. And now we finally understand why it felt so real. Because it was. And for Michael, that truth was never meant to shock or surprise. It was simply the final piece of a love story she had never written down. Until now. For more emotional stories, check out this video.